Transnet's main ports were up and running by Friday, with the state-owned companies a forced maneuver due to lift in a matter of days. But the last ripple of a recent cyber attack that forced the logistics company to switch the manual operations was still being felt. On the 22nd of July, Transnet was hit by a cyber attack, a security intrusion and sabotage. This is according to the company, with its provisioned Transnet port terminal being among the hardest hit. The hack disrupted normal processes and also damaged equipment and information, culminating in the declaration of a force majeure at the port's container terminals. The force majeure will end on the 2nd of August at container terminals in ports of Cape Town, Durban, Ngqura and Gqeberha. Joining me now is Gavin Kelly, the CEO of the Road Freight Association, Terry Gale, that's the chairperson of the Exporters Club of the Western Cape, and Gabriel Leroux, who's a cyber specialist. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on the program this afternoon. Gabriel, I'll start with you. Firstly, just explain to us the nature of the cyber attack and how was Transnet's system hacked?
I think that's quite a broad statement off the bat. Yeah. I think there's going to be a bit of investigation before we can answer that with a matter of fact. As far as we know, it has been what we see as a ransomware attack. We haven't quite figured out the origins of it, but that is as far as the information we've got. So it has been a ransomware attack as far as we're aware.
While we wait for more detail regarding the exact circumstances, let's speak about the prevalence of these kind of attacks. Are they quite frequent?
There have been, especially this year, there's been a number of attacks, especially in these sort of industries. A couple this year being Virgin Active in the local shores. I think there was one in the States not long ago on the infrastructure side for the Colonial pipeline, which also almost did a very big backlog for petrol and fuel as a whole for the eastern coast of America. So yes, they have been quite prevalent.
Terry, let's bring you into the conversation. And of course, you are representing the Exporters Club of the Western Cape. Speak to us about the impact and, well, the ensuing impact that's caused by such a cyber attack on the country's ports. What has been the extent of the damages caused?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Terry, I want you to speak to us about the extent of the problem. What impact has this cyber attack caused?
Again, it's actually, how do we put this into words? Because first of all, we never ever anticipated anything like this. And the sad problem was that we were just coming out of what happened in KwaZulu-Natal with the port of Durban. Actually, so we had that incredible, horrible situation that we were in, the challenges we were facing with the port not being able to get cargo moving from Durban to Johannesburg, the main artery there. That was that problem. Then suddenly when we thought things were actually going correctly, we then get the cyber attack, and that was on the Thursday morning of the 22nd of July. I don't think any of us would take any cognizance of it and never ever realize the severity of the situation. It was something that we thought, well, it's going to be cleared up overnight, but of course it didn't. It took them up until this last week, this last Thursday, when we were seeing a little bit of clarity. The situation with regard to the export side, which obviously is our main focus, it's been disastrous because we never moved any export boxes at all from last Thursday. We were only started moving our first containers into the terminals. In actual fact, we're working today as well. So we start getting containers moving. We didn't have what we call stack days for 10 days. We couldn't load anything. We couldn't forecast anything because there was no communication, because everything at Transnet was down. There was nothing working. And we kept on saying to them many years ago when they went in this IT system, when they endorsed and they started on the NAVA system, which when it works is fabulous. When it doesn't work, as we can just see now, it's a disaster. We said, what is your backup system? What is your support system here? And they couldn't actually give us an answer. And we really realized to our detriment what it was. The problem also is, of course, that we have generally in good times, we have weekly services to our main trading partners. We didn't have that. And that's one of our big selling factors being at the southern tip of Africa. One of our biggest is the fact to move move cargo efficiently and fluidly and almost on a guaranteed sailing. So we didn't have this. How do we tell this to the people overseas, to people who want to invest in our country, the image that we actually give? We had a problem with the ports. We had no support system going for this. There were some citrus containers, I do believe, that got into Durban, but of course they couldn't be loaded. Because the port was not working, so that didn't help either. It really, it was an untenable situation, and to be honest with you, put it in a nutshell, it's been a nightmare of 10 days. So that's just putting it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Gavin, in the same breath, it's being described as disastrous or a nightmare, like what we've heard from Terry a short while ago. Let's bring you in here to discuss the backlog at the country's ports, with perishable food now stuck in containers and freight trucks. What has been the impact on the freight industry specifically?
Good afternoon, Francois, Gabriel, Terry, all the viewers at home. Sorry, what was the question? I think one starts with the nightmare. Obviously, once you can't move anything in and out of the ports, it begins to place a set of brakes on the whole logistics system. You know, a truck doesn't just go down to the port to get what we call a box, a container, and then move it somewhere and that's it. That's normally part of a leg, and that leg might be an up and a down from a set place, or it might just be part of its movement between a number of places. Very much like the ships that come and call at our ports. They aren't just coming to Durban or to Cape Town. They're actually stops on the way between wherever they came from, which could be Shanghai, all the way to Rotterdam. Let's just use those two. And I use those as extreme for California, something like that. So the first thing is that anyone who did any sort of business in terms of moving containers in and out of ports suddenly found their whole operations had a big hole in it, or it was totally jammed because now they couldn't move. And of course, a lot of trucks stood around because generally what's happened when the system has gone down, it's been a couple of hours sorted out. So people didn't want to move. Guys don't want to lose their place in the queue, which is actually quite a huge thing once you've got into this queue into the port, whether in or out. So of course, that placed a huge brake on the whole logistics process. And some of those trucks might have been moving something totally unrelated a day later or during the day later between two warehouses to retailers. So we started to see that some of the companies couldn't meet their commitments. Obviously, a lot of guys work on a principle of being paid on delivery, so on consignment as stuff comes in and out. Right. So a lot of these operators for 10 days generated no revenue. Their assets were standing. Their drivers couldn't work. They couldn't jump out of the queue because nobody knew whether, all right, it might start in an hour's time, and back I go to the end of the queue. So it had a disastrous effect on the way in which we could schedule our trucks. And those companies who've got more than one truck, well, you know, good luck to them. They might have been able to have got a spare truck to do something else. But a lot of guys were caught in a queue, not actually being able to do anything.
Well, Gavin, we will continue to just zoom a bit closer into the effect, but I want to go back to Gabriel, who earlier discussed how prevalent these security intrusions are and this type of sabotage. But Gabriel, please just give us perspective as to how seriously companies should be taking the issue of internet security. Of course, companies vary according to size, whether big or small, but just how much should we be spending into looking at our security systems and ensuring that we can avoid these kind of hacks?
I think that's a very good question, and I think the short answer is that IT cyber attacks are no longer an IT problem. They're a business problem, and that becomes everybody's problem. As Gavin has rightly pointed out, how many people are sitting there without jobs or money lost and time lost. There is a lot of things that could have been put in place to actually avoid these situations. So for me, it is one of the most important vectors when, especially in a post-COVID world, we are all working remotely. The attack surface is greatly bigger. And so we really need to focus on looking after our networks as a whole, especially from your SMEs, from mom and pop shop at home, all the way through to your large enterprises like this, because And at a scale like this, recovery doesn't take a week. It could take months. So I'd like to just make that clear that there's a whole bunch of forensics that needs to happen here, and you can't just switch the light back on, because you need to find out if there's anything left off in the network for future reference. And that is the thing that people don't understand. It's not a light switch that you can turn on. It's like trying to get rid of cockroaches in your house. It's very, very difficult. So, yeah.
Now, as we wrap up this part of our conversation, and before I let you go, Gabriel, I just want to speak to you about just how quickly, I mean, it strikes me as though it takes quite a while to fix such a problem. Of course, the Transnet issue has since been, fixed just to refer to a lighter term. But how long usually does it take to get rid of such a problem?
It all depends on your IT hygiene that was taken before. What steps, what of precaution have you taken? As Terry rightly pointed to, what sort of backups have you got? And if you've got all the steps and procedures in place, it's very easy to mitigate these attacks. But once it's happened, it can take weeks and it can take months. The most recent attack locally at one of our gyms it took them up to 8 weeks to actually come back right, just to get you scanning back into the gym. So it is a mean feat, and it's easier to do it proactively rather than reactively.
But is there anything curious about the timing of this particular attack, especially at Transnet? Did anything catch your attention regarding the timing of it?
That's a very, very precarious question, and I'd prefer to just steer clear of that entire conversation from my perspective. I can only work with the facts that I have at hand, unfortunately. Okay. But, yeah, it's easy to make jumps and leaps in times like these.
Let's stick to facts, and let me bring Terry back into our conversation. Now, Terry, of course, this comes at a time after those major backlogs caused by the recent unrest in KZN. Just explain to us how the situation has been made worse by this cyber hack.
Well, of course, thank you very much for that question. I think the problem, of course, has been because the ports in Durban were not working because of backlogs, and they could not get the containers that they were discharging. They couldn't get them out the port, or they couldn't get them on the highway to Joburg or the Gauteng because of disruption, especially at the Majeure Plaza that we all know about. That was actually quite horrific. So you almost had a week of no movement of containers. The port itself was working. Of course, there were obviously some strikers and that going on, but port itself did work. So the backlog already started, the containers being discharged, they could not move, which they should have moved. And unfortunately, the situation is, it's something that is being addressed, but it's a long-term process. There is no backup from the point of view of having a rail link. There used to be a very, very reliable, viable rail link between the port of Durban and City Deep Terminal in Johannesburg, which worked well at the outset of containerization. But unfortunately, the way the world is at the moment, and what happened, the rail in South Africa has not been focused as it should be. So it's been a major, major concern that we have not had the rail link that we should be having. We are lucky that from one point of view, from the Cape Town side, Cape Town was operational, of course, until this had on the 22nd of July. But the problem, of course, from the Cape Town point of view is we've had a lot of equipment challenges here, a lot of aging equipment, and of course we also have with vessels ranging, which takes place in the winter when they cannot work vessels at the terminal, and we've actually had quite a severe winter as well. So the weather has also played a part in delays. And bottom line, what has actually affected us, and I'm actually involved on a task team with Transnet as well, because many vessels have been bypassing Cape Town. And the situation with what has happened now, the outcome of all this is that we have vessels bypassing South African ports and going up to Maputo, ports that actually are working. And we have Walvis Bay as well. Walvis Bay is a very good port. Walvis Bay is working very well. And we, as I said, they're just sitting waiting for something to happen in South Africa.
I see you on a roll, and I understand why, because there's much to be said about the situation. But I want to take a quick break and continue with our conversation shortly after this. When we continue with our conversation, we'll speak about just the impact of that cyber attack at Transnet. Speaking to us, of course, a reminder that It's Gavin Kelly, Terry Gale, as well as Gabriel Leroux, who's a cyber specialist. Continue our discussion on the impact on the Transnet cyber attack on the country's ports. Joining us for that conversation is Gavin Kelly. He's the CEO of the Road Freight Association. Terry Gale, the chairperson of the Exporters Club of the Western Cape, as well as Gabriel Leroux, who's an IT specialist. Gavin, let's continue with you. Now, importers and exporters have been left frustrated, and some even describing the situation, as we heard earlier in our conversation, as a nightmare and simply chaotic. Initially, no containers could be moved in and out of the ports, but Transnet has since moved to a manual system. Explain this to us.
Well, obviously what happened is that if you want to export or import anything through the ports, and they are ports of entry, even if they're on the seaboard side of the land, you need to have some sort of system that monitors or maintains or controls the way in which goods are brought in and sent out of the country, whether this is for a duty-based reason or whether it's just in terms of economy or for the traders themselves. And obviously we have a huge amount of goods that come through our ports that are actually transiting through South Africa, or they're transiting in the process of manufacturing. So they might come in a stage of manufacture but not final product. So, for example, we have a lot of automotive components that come into ports, then go to the assembly plants. They get assembled. Eastern Cape's a good example, so is Durban. And then that final assembled automobile is then put in a crate and sent out the country again. So it's a very important process that needs to have some sort of control, which is this NAVIS system. And I'm not sure what the acronym is. I'm sure everyone by now has worked out their own acronyms for it. And this controls is able to identify the box as it goes, where it goes, who's responsible for what, who should come and pick it up, who's allowed to come and pick it up, and when it comes back in again. So the box is really, really controlled and watched as it goes through the country. What we have now said is, guys, we don't really know, and I'm now also out on a limb like Gabriel was, we don't exactly know how this hack happened or who's behind it or why it happened. So one of our questions is, go find out. Don't go look for who's to blame. Go find out how it happened and fix it so it can't happen again. But we're telling the rest of the world that, we used to be a productive, reliable, efficient port. You could send stuff to us and we'd get it up into Africa within 7 days or whatever the case was. We'd get it through efficiently, quickly, safely. Nobody would try and steal it or burn it. Now we're saying we're not so sure. And this has had a huge effect. So a lot of freight that would have gone through South Africa going into the short to medium future, there are clients who are saying maybe we shouldn't move South Africa. There were even South African producers who have started to move some of their goods through Maputo. Now that we can't have happening, because that has a knock-on effect on the whole of our logistics chain. We're not just talking about companies making profits. We're talking about work. We're talking about all of those support industries. And we're talking about our key assets like the ports actually doing what they need to do to ensure as a country we may remain globally competitive.
With that said, Gabriel, I need to go back to my question earlier on. I mean, it also prompts the questions around, is it possible to investigate or trace back the source of such a cause or compromise and the extent of the ICT data security breach or even acts of sabotage? Now that we know that investigations are underway to determine what exactly happened here, what kind of task is at hand here? How big would such an investigation be?
The thing for this is that Transnet is a huge network, okay? They've got their core network and they've got a whole bunch of applications syncing into this thing. Right. So the vector, the attack surface is so big that, yes, there will be logs on the computer. Yes, you will be able to go back and eventually find out where they got in, how they got in with the methods that we have. But the more important thing is that you kind of want to know why and where. And right now, we understand that it's most likely the ransomware called Death Kitty. The interesting thing is that they've not actually, usually ransomware agents, they sort of advertise who they are. They hire over the dark web quite publicly to get hackers involved. But these guys have stayed anonymous. There's absolutely no, it's completely anonymous. So we don't even have somebody putting their hand up to say, yes, this was us. No one has claimed it. So from that side, we cannot say it's sabotage. And with that reason, there may be a sort of lead towards sabotage, but it will come out in the end. Most of the time, things like this could be found with just purely machine learning programs that are running out there, phishing programs that are running out there, that they might not have, they might have just stumbled across a vulnerability within the Transnet network, or it could have been a very, very well orchestrated, targeted attack to actually get in there. And only time will tell. But the scope, the scale of damage that's been done has been quite quantified by Gavin and Terry, respectively.
So, Terry, let's bring you back. The disruption also threatens to have somewhat of a ripple effect on Africa's most industrialized economy, particularly as Transnet's Durban port handles about 60% of the nation's shipments. How important are these ports, especially for the layman?
Well, obviously, from the South African point of view, I mean, South Africa still imports a lot of its items, and it's not just fully manufactured. We import a lot of goods that go into the manufacture for goods that then need to be exported. So we do, whether it's certain components, like Gavin says, for the automotive industry, which we do a lot of assembly of vehicles. It's one of our biggest manufactured exports. All that ground to a halt. So, I mean, we read about in Durban in particular, Toyota, one of the biggest employers in Durban, actually said that they are seriously thinking of closing their plant down in Durban, and maybe even pulling out of Durban and ultimately pulling out of South Africa, which actually we cannot afford. I think, if I'm not mistaken, LG also said the same in Durban. They've got huge plants. Because of what happened in Durban, they obviously rely a lot on imports because of the component parts that have to come in and they assemble at their plants here. There are major employers in KwaZulu-Natal, and also leading on to, we take the BMW plant in Pretoria, we take the Ford factory that we have in Port Elizabeth. All that still, Ford is now also in Pretoria as well. All that actually comes into being, that all plays, and all these are major employers. And the bottom line is always from South Africa, our biggest problem is unemployment. When one is employed and one has work, you find you're not going to do the things that these people are doing. They actually were in a desperate situation. Unfortunately, there were people who obviously took advantage of it as well, as always. But it just saddens to see, because how can we afford to lose a company like Toyota? All the confidence that we've built up since the 27th of March 1994 almost just was disappeared overnight. And then, as I said, was just what happened. Then, of course, the port system goes down. So we really have a big job ahead of us to rebuild that confidence on the global stage.
Now, Terry, I see your cat also wants in on the action and is seemingly quite interested in what we are discussing.
Sorry about that. I can't control it.
Not a problem.
Sitting in the office here alone, you see, actually that's...
Not a problem. I completely understand. Gavin, let's bring you back. I mean, the ports are also seen as key to shippers from landlocked African countries, including the DRC, Zambia, as well as Zimbabwe. Please elaborate on this aspect for us.
Well, over the last many years, many decades, a lot of infrastructure in Africa has either not been upgraded, has been pretty archaic, or it's actually deteriorated. And we've seen some of that happening in our own railway lines here in South Africa, unfortunately. So over the years, South Africa provided that transport, and a lot of that transport then became road-based. And obviously the roads are also in Africa and in certain parts of our country not what they should be. So what has happened is that because we've had good functioning ports that have been reliable, they've been productive, they've been safe, a lot of goods have moved through South Africa. And South Africa was called the gateway to Africa. It's still referred to as the gateway to Africa. But the countries around us have, over the last decade at least, begun to get their local domestic acts together, whether those are political differences, whether they're their economies, whether it's in terms of investment. And for example, Walvis Bay and Maputo have done huge investments in terms of their ports. So, a couple of years ago, where Walvis couldn't take a large number of ships in to take containers, now has built 2 brand new wharfs, and they are actually drawing ships to Walvis. They've, in conjunction with Zambia, have built a new railway line all the way through the Kripibi strip to Zimbabwe and Zambia, and now rail these containers in a very efficient system. Maputo's done the same. They've had the Chinese in. They've worked on that on that harbour. And then, of course, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Mombasa in Kenya, Luanda in Angola. So all of the countries around us have actually started to improve their infrastructure and are becoming competitors where in the past we didn't have these. We, on the other hand, have not stayed ahead of the international game. I'm not going to now try and blame Storm whether we've looked after our ports here. What we have done is we've taken our eye off the ball of the international game. We've lauded what's been happening around us, but in actual fact, I don't think we have really understood what it's doing to us in terms of the international game. So a lot of that movement through South Africa now has options to go to. And something that happened in South Africa over the last 3 weeks, the looting and the ports not being operative, has allowed some of that cargo, some of that business, to actually pull up their heads, look around and say, are there alternatives, and are they viable alternatives? Not just in cost, but if they are reliable and they are safe, perhaps that's what we should use. And that is the greatest danger for us going ahead. We can fix the ports now. We can fix the IT. But if there's nothing coming in, it's not going to help us.
So we are fast running out of time. But Gabriel, let me give you the parting shot here. And as this investigation looks at how to prevent such an intrusion from happening again, what would you say are some of the lessons to be learned here, especially for small businesses?
I think you definitely just need to make sure that you've got your checks and balances in order. A good working backup solution, off-site, away from the source, is a good option. Make sure that you've got a reputable endpoint solution. Make sure that you've got really good IT hygiene. Password management, as silly as it sounds, can change an entire business like this. This could have been as simple as one leaked password and this entire network has crashed. So password management, simple hygiene, and a good backup solution, very important. And from my perspective, much like Australia, much like the US, they're starting to band together as nations, not necessarily organizations, to actually approach this ransomware issue from a centralized, nationalized perspective. And I really think that South Africa could do really well in creating some sort of a corporation or organization rather to get the heads that we have in this country, because we've got some incredible people in this country in the IT space, security space, together, working together to actually get this sorted from a national perspective.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. That's our panel of experts. We had Gavin Kelly, the CEO of the Road Freight Association, a cyber specialist, Gabriel Leroux, as well as Terry Gale, the chairperson of the Exporters Club of the Western Cape.